Okay, Eli, did you want to start us off with sort of the logistics and the security measures while people are joining us? And then hopefully by
Absolutely.
that point, we'll have all our participants and then we can dive into the actual webinar.
Absolutely.
Right,
All right.
thanks.
Well, good morning, everyone. So just, before we get started with the webinar, I just have a couple housekeeping items to go over. First, I just want to talk about security a little bit. So in order to provide safe and secure virtual spaces, we've taken some measures to mitigate the risk of Zoom hacking. We're using Zoom's dedicated webinar platform. So all attendees of this webinar were required to register in advance, and there's a password. By default, all participants are view only. That being said, during the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to click the raise hand button and we'll unmute you to ask those questions. Or you can type them in the Q&A box, which I'll be monitoring throughout the webinar. And that function also allows you to ask the question anonymously if that's something you want to do. After the presentation, we're going to open things up to a larger group discussion. And for this, we will go through and unmute everyone so you're able to share points and questions as you wish. Just a quick disclaimer, this webinar is being recorded, so we can post it on our website and to our YouTube channel for those that were unable to attend today so they can go back and see it. And then finally, after the webinar, I'm going to be sending out a very brief feedback survey. And if you could all please complete that, it'd be greatly appreciated. The surveys really provide us with important feedback that we need and use to make sure we're delivering the best possible webinars we can be. And with that, I will pass it off to Marley. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Eli. And thank you all for joining us today. So my name is Marley Kozak. I am your host for today's webinar. I'm a community-based monitoring program coordinator with the Government of Alberta. And today I'm joining you from Treaty 6 in Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 4 in Edmonton, Alberta. So today's webinar is actually part of a larger monthly webinar series titled Keeping the Fire Burning. And these monthly webinars are a platform for knowledge sharing and learning under an initiative that I'm involved with called Fire with Fire. Fire with Fire is a multi-year collaboration between the Resilience Institute, who are based out of Canmore, Alberta, the Resource Stewardship Division of Alberta Environment and Parks, who I am involved with, and 4 Indigenous communities across Alberta, Kainai First Nation, Pagani First Nation, Samson Cree Nation, and Dena'ina First Nation. With Fire, what we're trying to do is working towards bringing together Indigenous and scientific understandings of changing fire regimes. So the goal is that this will lead to new insights and innovative practices to enhance local, regional, and provincial climate change resilience. There are 2 main areas of work within Fire with Fire to achieve this goal. One is community capacity building through participatory video and other participatory methodology trainings. And then there's also knowledge sharing, which includes these webinars. So today's webinar is Prescribed Burning in Canada, Part 1, and it's going to focus on Alberta's agriculture and forestry's prescribed fire burning, which works towards reducing the risk of wildfire to Albertans and their communities while balancing the benefits of wildfire on the landscape. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dave Schroeder. Dave is a prescribed fire program coordinator with Alberta's Agriculture and Forestry, and he supports the delivery of Alberta's prescribed fire program. Dave works with partners such as FireSMART and Parks Canada to coordinate research projects focusing on vegetation management effectiveness, as well as to develop and deliver training for prescribed fire planning. In addition to Dave's professional work, he is also a precision sawdust maker and the occasional picture framer, furniture, and cabinet maker, as well as a weed picker and urban gardener. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Dave. Dave, thank you so much for joining us, and the platform is all yours.
Thank you. Just do another audio check here.
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real privilege to speak to this audience, and thank you for the nice introduction. I've had the privilege in the last 20 years to travel across a lot of Alberta and be part of prescribed fires and wildfires across much of the province. And so I've seen our wilderness and agricultural areas from north to south, and including the far northeast where there's roadless access. So I've been very privileged that way, and so I hope that this presentation reflects some of that experience. And I do also come from a research background, a Western science research background, and so some of my presentation will be a little bit in more in depth about that. And I think Eli had indicated we would do questions more at the end, but I'm also open to the idea that that there could be some questions or comments in between. I suspect that there are some folks in the audience who've been involved with firefighting and have done prescribed burns, and so my apologies to you if I'm trying to tell a cowboy how to ride a horse here, but I hope to get some of your insights from your experiences as well. So without further ado, I'll get going on my presentation here. So a few formal definitions. I'll talk a little bit about how I picture the context of prescribed fire in Alberta. So CIFC is the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center, and they organize the exchange of wildfire suppression resources across Canada. And if you've been a firefighter, you might have been involved in a CIFC exchange to another province, or worked with folks coming from other provinces to help us here in Alberta. So they have a definition for prescribed burning and a definition for prescribed fire, and they're very similar. I put them up there just for the audience to understand that there's two different terms. They're often used interchangeably, but they can be thought of a little bit differently. And so from my personal perspective, and what I try and promote through our branch, is that a prescribed burn is an event such as what you see on the bottom left or in the center, and prescribed fire is something more like our program. So we're trying to administer and deliver a program of prescribed fire that includes many prescribed burns. But those are really my definitions, and there's no problem using them interchangeably. And just for some context, there's only 2 bullets on the first point, but really that represents thousands of years of fire use, and I use the term fire inclusion, and I hope I hope that's an accurate term, and correct me if there's a better term later on, please. And really, what the big contextual impact here is that in the last 120 years or 150 years, things have really changed dramatically, and that is entirely due to European settlement. So we had a lot of land clearing on the prairies and the aspen parkland, and what came out of that was fire exclusion. And there's a really good television program by PBS. This was done by Ken Burns, who's just a fantastic documentary television producer, and he's done a series on the Big Burn, and really that included Alberta and BC. A lot of those fires that scorched a lot of Montana and Idaho and elsewhere, those came into Alberta and BC and burnt a lot of hectares. And from that, fire became an enemy. I think that might be a very strong word, but I think that's how it became perceived. because there was a lot of destruction. There were deaths, many deaths, and that the big burn was the big incident. But there were also in eastern North America, there were some terrible settlement clearing fires that resulted in many fatalities. And in modern forestry, that's really, in terms of timelines, it's from the 1940s on when mechanization became widely available to forest industries. And so fire exclusion continues. There was a lot of work done for silviculture burning. So after timber harvesting occurred, foresters would burn the blocks, and that was good for regeneration. And it had a side benefit of also reducing the hazardous fuel load. But the objective for season suppression, and we've had a favorable period of weather the last few decades where suppression has been more effective perhaps than it would be with a wider or more variable weather patterns, which we're starting to see now in recent years. And prevention has really worked very well. Most people know Smokey Bear. It was one of the most successful marketing icons of all time. We do have Birdie Beaver in Alberta, but the message that dominates the media and influences the public is that fire is bad. And the bottom photo, that's from the movie Bambi, and that's another example of a very popular movie giving the perception that fire is an unwanted enemy of the public. So in this era now, there is more of a desire for fire inclusion. And I think this program by the Resilience Institute is an example of that. There's very little silviculture burning happening now for various reasons that I've outlined. We continue to do hazard reduction burning around communities, and I'll be showing some slides of that soon. And community protection has become a very dominant focus of our work now. And unfortunately, it's not something that we're always successful at, and we've experienced that in Alberta with many communities affected through evacuations or worse. And an interesting thing, and this is something that I'm really excited about in my discussion with Marley leading up to this presentation, is this idea that Western science is largely relearning what was known. And that is that fire is critical for ecosystems, and also it's critical to provide benefits to humans. So that, there's been documentaries about other examples. I recently saw an episode of David Suzuki where they were talking about the clam beds that the different communities on the West Coast used and developed to improve the ecosystem and provide food for themselves. So I'm excited about the potential to think about how can we do that for wildfire in Alberta. And so we do have a desire to do more prescribed burning in Alberta, but it's not a simple switch to turn on. There's a lot of influence by the different messaging, and ecosystems have changed. There's been a lot of areas that have not had frequent fire for many decades, and so things have changed, and you can't just start using fire again and things will go back to a more desirable state. So what about the future? Well, there's a need for fire inclusion. Climate change is going to equal more unwanted wildfire, and we're seeing that in Canada. The number and frequency of fires is going up, and they're higher intensity fires, and we're especially seeing it in the western United States. Every year it seems they're going through some terrible experiences, and you often see in the media that one of the solutions is more controlled burning. And I've given an example in the news media where the BC Premier has called for more burning. And so that's what they're trying to do. So on top of that, there's new challenges like mountain pine beetle, and and we're dealing with that in Alberta almost across the province. And suppression is very costly. It's very, very costly, and we can't keep up. It's very easy to get overwhelmed, and so we need to find other or reinvigorate old tools to make our landscapes healthier and more resilient. So I'll get into a bit more about prescribed fire in detail now. We do burning in Alberta for quite a few different objectives, and every burn will have an objective, but will also have many benefits attached to it. So you can see there's a lot of overlap. Anything that's restoring ecosystem functions is going to be good for either forest health or grazing improvement or both, and very often there's wildlife habitat benefits, and so these things are very interchangeable, but any burn will have a good objective and good benefits. And not included in this, especially in Alberta, is that it's a fantastic training tool. So our fire crews really value the opportunity to, in the early spring, to get out and do some burning, and it gets them in the right mindset to face the fire season ahead. And then we do some larger burns for landscape fuel breaks, and I'll show examples of those. And then we do some small burns for research, but they are yielding big results, and I'll talk about those as well. And just this will be the only graph I show, and I don't think there's a test or anything, but I just wanted to share with you a general idea of how much burning we do. So those numbers at the top of the bars, those are hectares per year. So we generally will burn somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 hectares per year. And most of that is for community protection, so hazard reduction burns around communities, and then occasionally some other larger burns that are for landscape fuel breaks or ecosystem restoration. And then, of course, this year was very quiet because of the COVID, and it was quite rainy, and the same situation occurred in 2019. So we've had a couple of slower years, but I expect that that'll pick up again. So I'll talk a bit about community protection, and this is really about most of the burning we do is in northern communities where there's a lot of grass fuel. We call vegetation that burns fuel. So I'll be using that term quite a bit, and we do a lot of work to remove fuel in the springtime in and around northern communities. So when I show this slide to students, if sometimes they're not really sure if there is a hazard, but really that grass, and the gentleman is not kneeling, he's not a midget, he's so that's very tall grass, and you can see in the background they've started burning it, and I'm sure he'll get out of that grass very quickly before they light that part up. But the grass fuel hazard is it grows tremendously well in Alberta, and it's something that needs to be dealt with on a regular basis, annual if possible. So here's another example where the fire crews are burning right up against or right next to people's homes. And for folks from the north, maybe some of the folks from the Dene Ta Nation, they might even recognize these photos. This is from around the high level area. But for folks that are not from the north or from larger urban areas, this is an interesting photo, because here's our our crews, and that includes members of the local communities. They're burning right next to people's homes, and you can see that they've blackened a perimeter around the burn so that they can safely burn the inside of the field and remove that fuel hazard. And you can see in the next photo here that we also use helicopters to burn larger meadows. So those little fire points, those are from the helicopter dropping what we call ping pong balls. It's a little, it really is a ping pong ball, and it's filled with a fluid that is injected with another chemical that results in a reaction that creates a fire. And so these can be dispensed from a helicopter very efficiently, and you can see how they're using the road or the adjacent forest where there would still be some snow to very quickly burn off a large meadow. And the way that they're doing the ignition is so that the smoke goes straight up and impacts the community as minimally as possible. So again, this is another photo from around the high level area. And this is an example I love to give to folks of the benefits. So this is a case study. I won't go into it in a lot of depth, other than to say that in April, early April 11th, the year doesn't really matter. They had done some hazard reduction burning in and around a community, and I'll show that picture on the next slide. And then a month later, in May, exactly a month later, there was a fire discovered in that community as well. And because the fire hazard was quite high, we had dispatched aircraft and crews right away to get to put that fire out, because it's right in a community. So here's what's happened. All that you can see the fire in the trees smoldering away. You can see the community around the bush there. What's interesting is that green field. That's the area that was burnt a month prior. So by doing that burn, the fire really couldn't grow into that field, and it really helped the crews contain it to where the ignition occurred. And so it had direct benefits to this community. There was no evacuation needed, and the infrastructure remained safe, and the people remained safe. And it also freed up the fire crews to deal with other fires should they have occurred. So there's multiple benefits that way. But this is a really great example of how those burns are really effective. So moving from community protection burns to other objectives and benefits. So this is an example in the Peace River country along the river where we do wildlife habitat burns. So you can see this is a reburn area. So they had burnt this a few years prior to this event, but what they're trying to do is decrease the amount of aspen and improve the grazing opportunities for the wildlife. And I remember a previous colleague of mine who's retired. When he was a young ranger, they could just go out on a nice day with a flare gun on the jet boat and shoot the flares at the riverbank, and it would burn up to the top, and the day's work would be done. Nowadays, it takes extensive planning. All stakeholders need to be consulted on this, on doing these kind of burns, and then we have to prepare a guard, because the forest at the top of the bank now is part of a forest allotment, so that it's a lot more involved and a lot more costly to do a burn like this, but the basic value of doing them it still occurs, and so even though it's more effort, we still go out and do them. And like I said as well, the value to the crews to get some training on terrain like this and working with different conditions is really beneficial from a training perspective. So as we're scaling up here, one of the areas that we've done some burns in, primarily on the in the mountainous and foothills areas of Alberta, are to enhance landscape diversity. So we know that forest encroachment is a problem in many parts of Alberta, and I'll show some slides that demonstrate that. And so we're losing grassland and shrublands, and those are very important for wildlife and for species, flowers and different plants that exist in shrublands. And they can also limit the potential for unwanted wildfires. We had at one time in the early 2000s hoped that we could do large burns and that would stop the progress of the mountain pine beetle, but we couldn't get those burns off in time, and had we done so, the beetles would have just flown over them or been blown over top of them when we had those major events in 2009 and 2012. And I think they found beetles had blown from BC all the way to Slave Lake. So that would be a little bit bigger prescribed fire than I think anyone would want to have in Alberta. So I think that many folks will have seen these kind of historical photos. There's a big program in place within Alberta and different research folks to use this archive. There are thousands of these survey photos that were taken in the early 1900s, and they're very high quality because they're on these large glass plates. So they've withstood time and have been discovered recently. And they paint a very interesting picture of what the forest condition was like right around that time when European settlement was changing the way fire was used on the landscape. And so the photo below reflects a fairly open landscape in the Castle Mountain area. You can see that the light gray, that's mostly shrub and grasslands, and then the darker colors in the valley bottom, those are mature trees. And then this next photo of the very same spot in the same valley shows how much the valley has changed now. There's trees on both sides, and so this represents a dramatic change. And it's interesting that there are a number of researchers that have been able to use these photos and using some interesting geographic information systems and computer modeling techniques, they can actually create estimates of the degree of land change between the early 1900s and the present era. So this gives us a tremendous snapshot in time that we previously thought was unavailable. And it's very valuable to show us how the vegetation mosaic has changed in our landscapes. And so what can we do to bring some of this back? I think there's a desire to have more landscapes like this. And so how can we do some of that? So we do some landscape scale prescribed burns. This is a place called Rock Creek. So it's at the northern boundary of Jasper National Park and Wilmore Wilderness Park. This was a prescribed burn that was done jointly with Parks Canada. We've done a number of those together over the years, and they've been very very successful, both in terms of delivery and developing positive working relations with both agencies. And what I really want to point out is on the top left, you can see how there's a burn mosaic. Not everything gets burnt, and not everything is completely consumed. And then on the bottom right, you can see 3 years post-fire how lush the meadows are, and there are still pockets of trees in the landscape as well. So it's really not a black and white event when we do burns like that. It results in a mosaic, and this is something that's not very well understood even by a lot of ecologists, because we just don't see these things very often anymore, whereas we know that in the past this kind of fire happened quite frequently. So I want to talk a little bit about a FireSMART landscape and what can prescribed fire do to contribute to that. And I'll get into an example of my colleagues in Rocky Mountain House. This is the Blackstone Gap, and on the far side, the upper right corner, is for lack of a better term, what we call the industrial forest. So that's a forest management agreement area, and that timber is allocated for resource extraction. And on the left side, the bottom left, that's the R11 management unit area, and that there is no formal harvesting in that area, and fire has been designated as the primary agent of disturbance. And we want to be able to allow fires to occur on their own, but we want to also prevent fires from getting through that gap, which is indicated in that yellow box, and causing unwanted damage. So what my colleagues have done is conduct a number of burns in and around that gap to create a bigger block for a potential wildfire within the R11 unit. And so here's an example of that fire being done in early spring, and here's the outcome. And I had mentioned earlier about fires having an objective and multiple benefits, and one of the benefits of doing these burns, because there's been very little disturbance, very little fire use in the R11 area for the last 100 and plus years, is that the biologists are very pleased that this provides habitat for sheep, for wild sheep. So this is the objective is to create a capping unit, what we call in our jargon, but the benefit has been also to provide better habitat for wildlife, and so that will also translate into a more diverse vegetation mosaic as well. So it's great that we can do these landscape burns in R11. It's a relatively isolated area. There are a few communities that might be impacted, so we can do these burns, and it's relatively straightforward. But what about other challenges? This is a view of the Kananaskis Valley, and this it's some people call it the crown jewel for Alberta tourism. I like it. It's a really nice place. It's beautiful. There are some wonderful hiking trails. What a lot of folks don't know is that valley burnt from end to end and rock to rock in 1936 in a matter of, I think it was 1 day, burnt out most of it, and then by 3 days it was completely consumed. So you can imagine on a given weekend, there might be tens of thousands of people in that valley. And the 36 burn happened in August on what would have been a long weekend. So this scenario is one of those that keeps my colleagues who are responsible for prevention of fires in Kananaskis. It keeps them up at night. It's very unnerving. But how do you deal with this? It's a park, and they don't want harvesting. So you have to be creative. And my former colleague Rick Arthur, who is now retired but a prevention officer in Calgary, he came up with this idea that we would use a harvesting machine to change the structure of the fuel. So on the top left, you see these stripes going up and down the hill. And what those are is they used a harvesting machine, a feller buncher, to cut down rows of trees. So it would change the nature of the fuel from being something that would crown in high winds to something that would burn more readily. So in order to solve their problem, they made the flammability of the forest worse. They made it easier to burn. And so what happened was on the bottom right, if I can direct your attention there first, that was on the hill adjacent to where they had done the work with the feller buncher. It was a natural forest, and they tried igniting that, and nothing happened. You can see that there's a bit of smoke, but no real crown fire, which is what they wanted to have for their prescription. So that was a bit unnerving, but Rick decided to move the ignition over to where they had done the feller buncher work, and you can see in the top photo on the top left that it worked really well, that the burn was very successful, and they were able to achieve their objectives. So it's a term we call fuel amendment, and they made it worse so that they could burn it while the adjacent forest would not sustain a fire, and it was very successful. And I'll show you here, this is the photo afterwards, and you can see even with all that fuel amendment work that there were still trees that didn't die. So there's still a bit of a patchwork mosaic, even though this is kind of an artificial one. And I'm happy to say that now there's a lot of grass growing in there, but also a lot of pine seedlings. And what the folks in parks would like to do is have this more open. So my colleagues are thinking about planning another burn where they would remove many of the seedlings, and that would provide more grassland, and that will be beneficial for more diverse plant life within the valley, and hopefully help with the minimizing the elk and human interactions, so that the elk would have a place that's a little bit more isolated where they have suitable habitat. So so prescribed burning is never one event, and this is where I talk about prescribed fire being a tool that you use continually, and that also reflects our understanding of how First Nations people used fire in valleys like this before settlement, where it was continually used in different areas. And so we're trying to think about this as a way of moving towards fire inclusion. So now I'm going to get into research burns. And again, I have a background in forest science, and I've some experience doing fire behavior research. So research burns have been used extensively to develop the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System. And for any folks who have been firefighters or interacted with firefighters, you might have heard about this, with the FWI or the FBP or the BUI or the FWI, lots of jargon, but it was developed in part through the use of research burns, and everyone in Canada uses it. And so it's a very powerful tool. It enables me to go to Ontario and do fire behavior work seamlessly and vice versa. So the research burns can improve the fire behavior models, and that's really what the Canadian system is. It's a set of models that we use to forecast fire behavior. And one of the things that we've been doing recently in Alberta is to validate FireSMART treatments. So perhaps in some of your communities, you've been involved, or you've seen different work being done on thinning or other kinds of work in addition to prescribed burning, where we're reducing the fuel hazard. And the bottom one is a newer type of fire growth model, and I call it a physics-based model. And really what it's doing is they're very complex, and they account for interaction between the atmosphere and the fire itself. So the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System is just a model that uses kind of like a regression relationship, but the physics-based models are more complex, and they calculate what the fire behavior should be at every step. And I won't get into a lot of detail about it, but those physics-based models can't work unless we have real fires to help validate whether they're performing correctly or not. So here's an example of a FireSMART test site. This is near Red Earth Creek in north central Alberta. And what we have in the top right of the picture is kind of a linear feature, and we did strip mulching in there. And then on the left, we use the mulcher to thin the stand. And then to the bottom, below those two stands, is a natural black spruce stand. So we lit the fire in the natural stand and allowed it to burn into the two FireSMART treatments, and then documented what happened. So one of the really cool things that we have are in-fire footage to show us what happens. And I'm just going to show that a short clip right now, and I'll have another one later on. Oops, that didn't work. Let's try this. There we go. So that was pretty neat. I have quite a few hours of footage on this, and I really enjoy watching it. And it really is very informative because it shows us how the wind and the embers and the trees ignite. One thing I'll also mention is that we're always looking for camera operators. It seems like people give that job a try, and it just doesn't work out. I'm kidding, of course. You may have seen in the footage on the right, there was a steel box. So we have a regular video recorder that you might have at home, and we put that in a steel box that has a brick lining in it, and it keeps the camera cool enough so that it can survive the passage of the fire and give us this valuable research information. So here is another example of of an output from the physics-based model that I was talking about. And so on the right is a test burn in the Northwest Territories. And then on the left is a simulation output that is trying to replicate what happened in reality. So I've just noted here that running that model, which was about 1.5 hectares, required 8 hours of calculations on a supercomputer. And by super, I mean super duper, the kind that you find in research labs. So this kind of modeling is not going to be usable in an operational sense when we have to give fire forecasts within minutes. but this helps us in research terms to evaluate the fire in say a FIRESMART treatment versus reality, and then we can use the model to test different kinds of treatments, knowing that we're able to emulate a realistic fire. So we have established a site in central Alberta to do more of these research burns. We call it Pelican Mountain FireSmart Research Site. It's near Wabasca in central Alberta, just south of town there. So it's in a very isolated spot. So we can do these burns with no risk to adjacent communities, but still have very good access to do the work that we want to do. And so this picture just shows a number of different research plots that we are planning or have set up. And then I'll just zoom in a little bit on the bottom right. This is one of our burn units that we set up, and it's similar to the one that I showed you in Red Earth Creek. So we have on the left photo, we have a control, a natural black spruce stand, and then on the right, we have two different kinds of FireSmart treatments, and those are the photos on the right, where we did some mulching or work with the hand crews. So what we want to do is light a crown fire in the control plot and let it burn into the treatments, and then document what's happened there. So I've been very fortunate to be part of a couple of burns where we have done that kind of work. And the next slide is going to be a video showing two different burns and two different outcomes. So I'll just show that video, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. I've never listened to that with headphones on before. It's quite a different experience. That was really good audio. But moving back, or just to recap, on the first video clip, the fire really changed dramatically. It went from an out of control crown fire to something that the fire crews could manage very, very easily. And in the second fire, we had the similar crown fire burn into it, but the fire behavior did not really change that much. So the in-fire cameras are really helping us to understand what was different. And so what we've learned from this is that it's very important not just to manage the canopy trees, the standing trees, but also the surface fuels. So in the first case, we had done a lot of work in the summertime to clean up all the debris, and we trampled it a lot. We were driving through there with ATVs to remove things, and we were walking around installing cabins. And in the second case, the work had been done in the winter, and there hadn't been a lot of trampling and cleanup, and that surface fuel really, as you could see, really carried a very intense fire. So this is really helping us to understand what we need to do differently, or what we can do in addition to thinning in the wintertime to make these treatments more effective. And we're doing some things like, I haven't got it in this slideshow, but there's many unburnt in this photo. Hard to believe, there's many unburnt clumps of sphagnum moss, and many of you will know that when you walk around after a fire, you see these clumps of unburnt moss, and they're still soaking wet, the sphagnum moss. And we're working with folks at McMaster University to see what can we do to increase the amount of sphagnum moss that we have in FireSMART stands. So we have got another spot at Pelican Mountain to look at how we can do that. So let's use what's there in nature to make the stands less flammable. And then we're also looking at, can we plant tamarack trees, because they are less flammable than black spruce. And so can we have a mixture of tamarack and black spruce that would make these stands less flammable? So again, doing these burns is very instructive, and having the videos really helps us understand the story of what happened. So I'll move away from research and talk a little bit about the future. And I've talked a little bit about how fuels and landscapes have changed since fire exclusion began. And that's been through our forest and suppression practices and a deficit of using prescribed fire. And there's more urban and far more wildland urban interface now than there ever has been. And that's not slowing down. Industry use within the forest and recreation, I'm calling that an industry. I guess the tourism industry is very important in some parts of the province. And so Alberta especially has got timber allocation and industrial use from the southern border to the northern tip of the province. So those are important stakeholders on our landscape. And there's less acceptance of smoke, especially in urban areas, where when you have wildfire smoke that comes up from BC or California and hangs around for a couple of days, it's really challenging. And I'm sure most folks on the phone or on the webinar have experienced that. But when we do hazard reduction burns, you have a couple of minutes to 20 minutes of smoke, and that's it. And then people also have this visual perception that a forest is damaged after it's burnt. And so there's very few people now that understand fire's role in biology's adaptation. So this is, again, a challenge that we have to deal with the messaging that fire is bad, when in fact most species are adapted to it and some really depend on it. And so one of our challenges is that we know animals have adapted to fire, so what's the problem? Why can't we do more burning? And it's the same bullet that I presented before, where the landscape around the Wilmore Wilderness has changed. So we can't just do burns in the Wilmore Wilderness because the caribou won't have anywhere else to go. So even though we've got the second biggest country in the world, we're running out of space. So this is something that we have to deal with. Another one is the smoke management, and I'm poking a little bit of fun at folks in Canmore here. This is really an unacceptable view from anywhere. If you think that this gray would be smoke and from a wildfire, but if it's a prescribed fire that we've deliberately lit, then somebody knows who to point the finger at, and so we have to be very careful about those things. But again, here's an example. This is Mount Nestor, just south of Canmore on the Spray Lakes Reservoir, and this is the smoke coming from that burn. It was a couple of 100 hectares. And this is the 2003 Lost Creek fire in the Crow's Nest Pass, just as a comparative example. So prescribed fires, they definitely do have smoke impacts, but it's far less than what we experience in wildfires. And I mean, we see that, we've experienced it, and we see it in the news all the time. And just for folks' awareness, if you haven't seen, there's this wonderful tool called FireSmoke Canada, and they do, during the fire season, they do daily air quality forecasting based on wildfire locations. So you can, this is a publicly available website. You can go on there. Alberta Health Services uses this to initiate health air quality warnings. But communities also, they take charge of their own health and well-being. So, this information can be very helpful because it forecasts where they estimate the air quality to be impacted from wildfire smoke up to 48 hours in advance. So it's a really valuable tool. If you haven't seen this, it won't really be working right now because we're outside of fire season, but it's a great tool to have. Further to challenges that we have are managing perceptions, and I talked about this. This is the kind of photo you see in the news. The large, intense fire, and they use terms like destructive and devastating and catastrophic. And when you use terms like that, it's hard it becomes a challenge to overcome that. And so the perception is not just the public, but through the media. And the media likes to use those terms because they grab attention. And maybe they just don't know. But here's what I would like to promote. And this is in Northwest Territories, just north of Fort Providence, where there's another research site like our Pelican Mountain site in Alberta. And that's the local firefighters from the Fort Providence crew. And what we're doing is some underburning in jack pine. And so this has been very interesting because from the Western science perspective, we're figuring out what is the ideal FWI number to burn these at so that we get good fuel consumption, but not too many trees burning. And then from the local crew perspective, it's been very helpful to them and to us to see how to actually do these burns. And obviously they've been firefighters for a long time. They figured it out pretty quickly, but they're also very very systematic in how they do it. So you can see the gentleman on the left in the background, he's carrying a Wajax bag, and so they can just walk around. If any tree starts to candle, they put it out. And so very few of the overstory trees die, and it cleans up the surface. And so I'm just going to wrap up with how this kind of burning has been resulted in a really interesting education experience for me personally. So this is Archie Cardinal from the Fort Chip fire crew, and we were doing some prescribed burns for research just south of Fort Chip. It was a very isolated area, so we could safely do burns. And what I want to draw your attention to is the green vegetation around there. So those are all blueberry plants, but they have no berries on them. So I could poke fun at Archie that he's got his bag there and it's empty and he's kind of looking despondent that there's no berries to pick. But what Archie is actually doing is helping us collect samples that we were using to assess the moisture content of the fuel for our research purposes. So we would do the sampling and then get in position, and then we did a series of 9 different test fires at different fire intensities. So in the top left, we did a higher intensity crown fire with full canopy consumption, and then in the bottom left, a moderate fire where there was some canopy consumption, and then on the top right, there's one of those cool fires again where we're just have a surface fire. And for my next slide, or for the next and last slide, here's an outcome. And it didn't matter whether it was a cool fire or an intense fire, although the cool fires resulted in more of those beautiful little blueberries on the bottom right. So what's amazing is I got to go back to the site 3 years after, and where the fires happened, the berries were lush. I could hardly concentrate on my work because I was eating so many. And exactly where the fire stopped, there were still lots of blueberry plants, but no berries. So it was, I always knew that fire was beneficial for berry production, but I'd never really seen it in such a dramatic fashion. And blueberry picking is something we do in my family very enthusiastically. So this was a real wonderful personal learning experience. And the other thing you can also see is there are lots of little pine seedlings in the top left photo. And so the forest is in that site is going to regenerate very, very nicely on its own without any help from anybody. So that wraps up my presentation. I have no idea how much time I took, but I hope you found it enjoyable.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. That was amazing. I definitely learned so much, and I love the imagery, and those videos that you showed inside the fire were amazing. I've never seen anything like that. So that was always it's always cool to be exposed to something new. So we are going to open it up to Q&A. Before we do that, I'm going to just read the first 2 questions that are in the chat box. And then Dave, you can respond to those. And then, yeah, we'll open it up to the rest of the participants. So again, everyone, if you want to directly ask Dave a question, we will release your video and your audio. I think you just have to raise your hand. And then you can, or if you want to share something, and then you can chat. Otherwise, you can use the chat box to ask a question.
Can I see the chat box?
I think you should be able to at the bottom where it says Q&A. Can you see that?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
Thank you.
So there's 2 down there right now. So the first one is, what happened in 2009 in terms of burning? Was it a single project or part of a province-wide initiative? So I actually saw this question come up when you were presenting. And do you remember when I believe it has to do with this slide, but do you remember when you showed the graph and it had the different years and it had the different objectives?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And 2009 was really, really high.
Yep.
So I believe that's what that question is referring to.
Yes, and that was exactly what happened. It was a single project. So we did a very large prescribed burn together with Parks Canada along the North Saskatchewan River, right at the parks border, so Saskatchewan crossing. So we started in Alberta and then burnt into the park, and that resulted in about a 7,500 hectare burn. And so that's why we have that big jump in the graph.
Great, thanks.
And yeah, you can, if you take a drive along the David Thompson Highway, you can see that burn, and there's a really cool interpretive trail called the Landslide Lake Interpretive Trail, where the Rocky Mountain folks have put up signs talking about the forest ecology and also the First Nations use of that site.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question that has been written was really interesting, thanks. Can you speak about how Indigenous knowledge could be integrated into this work, or is it already being done?
Yeah, that's something that we would like to do more of. And so I'll be honest, I haven't really known how to get going on that. So I'm hoping that by speaking with this audience and that we can start opening some doors that way. I don't want to make any presumptions about knowing what you know, what the full breadth of Indigenous knowledge is, but I think there's a lot of interest from the government of Alberta and my branch specifically to integrate that more into the work we do.
Okay, if there's anyone else that would like to ask a question, like I said, feel free to raise your hand and we can release your audio and video and you can ask Dave directly. I have a question. I guess I can get us started. So at the beginning of the presentation, you spoke about some prescribed fire objectives, so community protection, forest health, habitat improvement, etc. So I'm wondering what kind of work is done to evaluate how these objectives were achieved. So are people going out, you know, a year later, 3 years later, to see, okay, have ecosystems been restored? Has grazing areas been improved? So what kind of monitoring, I guess, is done? And are the people doing the monitoring and evaluation the same people that are actually doing the prescribed burning?
Very often it is the same people that do the monitoring. We also work with organizations such as the Wild Sheep Association. I've just gotten in contact with the Alberta Outfitters Association to talk to them about their using their membership to help report on burns. We use satellite technology to monitor how vegetation regrows after burns. So there are a number of different ways that we do it. We did have a field-based program that would go out and collect data. That since has been dropped, but the data that we've collected, we're translating to research and building tools where we hope that we can engage citizen science to help us collect some of that data. So yeah, there's many different ways that we can do that monitoring afterwards.
Great, thanks. I have another question then to sort of roll off of the Indigenous knowledge question that was asked earlier. is there a process in place, or do you think agriculture and forestry would be open to creating some sort of process where if there was an Indigenous community that was interested in developing community-specific cultural burning plans, that they could contact you or someone within ag and forestry to help them get that started, whether it was what you need to know to do a prescribed burn, or you know, resources or other organizations that they could get in touch with. I'm curious about what that process might look like.
Yeah, and we don't have a formal template in place, but there is an openness and a willingness to work towards that. And so a lot of the burns that we do on First Nations communities are often when it's on reserve land, then we work through a partnership with Indigenous Services Canada to provide, well, they provide us funding and memorandum of understanding for the forest protection area of Alberta to do prevention work and wildfire suppression. So there's that broader arrangement in place that would enable us to start doing some of this planning. And then it's just a matter of individual communities working together with my counterparts in the different forest areas. And because of the work together with the different communities, as in terms of prevention work that we've done or suppression work, most of our firefighters come from those communities. So there's already many very good relationships in place with the different communities. So moving forward with a new kind of, well, a new old kind of burn to do planning and so on, I think would be fairly straightforward, especially if, you know, I think it's something where you start off at a small scale and figure things out. But we do have resources in place, although like everybody within GEO right now, we're a little tighter, but we have those resources in place, and continuing to do ongoing community protection burns will be part of our mandate, something that we're going to continue to do. And so we can build on those to do other kinds of burns within those communities if it's desired.
Awesome, great, thanks. Okay, we have Neil raising his hand. So actually, Eli, can I rely on you to, I don't know how to get the audience to be able to be on video.
To be on video, go ahead, Neil.
No, I'll let you finish first answering Marley there.
Oh, I can put people on video. I just have to promote them to panelists, which will boot them from the meeting, and they'll have to come back. So probably just for this purposes, it's best if they just ask the question over audio.
Oh, okay.
So Marley, you might have chatted with Dave ahead of the presentation, but maybe just if you haven't done so already, maybe just summarizing the 4 First Nations that are involved with the Fire with Fire initiative. And then I would like to throw a question to each of the community members that are on the call today. If you have had any recent experience with prescribed burning in your communities, that would be of interest to hear back from those individuals. So maybe start with you, Marley, if you haven't summarized to Dave already the 4 First Nations, and then turn it over to the communities in terms of what their recent experience, if any, has been with prescribed burning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we did chat about the First Nations, but for anyone that might have missed the beginning of the webinar, and just as a refresher, I think that's a good point. So we're working with Dena'ina First Nation. Dena'ina is up in northern Alberta, so in an area where there is a lot of boreal forest, and they have been impacted by wildfires, especially over the last few years, quite severely. We're also working with Samson Cree Nation, and so this is a community about an hour south of Edmonton. They are in Maskwacis, so like just outside of Wetaskiwin. And then the other two First Nations we're working with are Kainai First Nation and Pagani First Nation. So they are down in southern Alberta. They're part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So sort of in like the kind of foothills area, you can see the Rocky Mountains off in the distance, so not too far from there. So definitely a range of different landscapes, I would say, or sort of fire regions across the province. Kainai and Pagani have also been exposed to wildfires. We had the massive wildfire in Waterton a few years ago. So that was a pretty significant fire, just in terms of the size, but also it went through a lot of culturally important and sensitive areas for the Blackfoot Nations. So yeah, those are the four that we're working with. And like I said, we have boreal forest up north and sort of the foothills and grasslands as we transition more south.
Thanks, Marley. So my challenge is to the participants, if you want to speak up about any recent experience. I think that might help Dave out in terms of understanding how those nations are showing up with respect to prescribed burn.
That's okay if there's no takers on that question. Yeah, and I won't speak on behalf of any of the communities, but I will say that the four that we are working with have expressed interest in exploring prescribed burning and doing, community specific cultural burns based on, like I said, experiences with wildfire that they've had and based on wanting to mobilize their knowledge. So hopefully in the next year, we can sort of, right now we're focusing on really just mobilizing knowledge and talking to communities about their knowledge around fire and the significance of fire and the way fire used to be used in community and how it's still being used. And then looking maybe to work with people like yourself, Neil, and Dave, and FireSMART, and enabling communities to really develop their own prescribed burning plans. So we have a few more minutes. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for the presentation. Like I said, that was absolutely amazing, very informative, very interesting. Loved those videos. That was great. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's always nice. It's always nice to have participants on the webinars. And this was part one of the prescribed burning in Canada. Part two is going to actually focus on what the federal government is doing. So stay tuned for an invite for that. So on behalf of the Fire with Fire team, I would like to thank Dave and all the participants for joining us today. Eli will be sending out a short feedback survey. So if you could take a couple minutes to fill that out, that would be great. We would really appreciate it so that we can keep delivering important, exciting, and meaningful webinars to you all. So have a great rest of your day, and we will see you all at the next webinar.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. And if you do have a question later on, feel free to reach out to me through Marley, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that come up later on. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.